Welcome to this third video in the series Principles in Practice, brought to you by the LIA. Why is economic freedom so important? The logical starting point of any such discussion also happens to cross over with the principle of individual rights, another one of the 7 liberalist principles. This origin point, simply put, is property rights, the first of which is the right to self-ownership. Until relatively recently in human history, and still to this day in some places, this deliberation of self-ownership has not been understood as a given in any way, shape, or form. All peoples and cultures have, throughout their past, engaged in the denial of self-ownership to others, be it through slavery, serfdom, or indentured servitude. These are just some of the names historically given to various forms of this denial. The transatlantic slave trade, the Islamic Barbary slaving raids on southern and eastern Europe, the slavery associated with African tribal warfare, the list goes on. Of course, throughout history there have been times, places, and people who opposed these practices. But, by and large, the near annihilation of slavery is a very recent and exceedingly profound benefit for our species. To view it solely in economic terms, slavery reduces potential consumers in a marketplace to being products. Even leaving any moral and ethical considerations aside, slavery is still bad from an economic perspective, as a consumer is of far greater value to the economy than any product could ever be. What is the economy? This is probably also an important question if we want to understand the importance of economic freedom, as well as what it means for a consumer to be greater than a product. To quote Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics, "The economy is the system that is used to decide upon the distribution of scarce resources which have alternative uses." Economies can have various forms, from free market to shared markets to controlled or planned economies. Each of these is defined by how much government intervention, regulation, and ownership is present within the market, but more on that shortly. First, we must define what is meant by scarce. Scarcity means, roughly defined, that there is always more demand for everything than the available supply permits. In other words, if we could get more of a thing for less, we would, and we could still make use of more despite that. The implications of scarcity are far-reaching, and it is our aim to make them at least a bit more clear by the end of this video. To return to the topic of the economy, distributing scarce resources. There are conceptually various ways of going about this. Socialist and communist governments of various stripes, including National Socialists, have tried centralized planning and nationalization of various industries. Throughout history, so-called protectionist policies, heavily taxing international trade, were even more common than they are today, as were fixed prices on various products to protect various industries or social classes, almost always with comparable disastrous consequences, namely famine, poverty, and squalor. One obvious reason for the many failures of central planning is the complexity of the economic system. Imagine a resource as seemingly simple as milk. The first obvious complication: there are various types of milk. Goat's milk, sheep's milk, cow milk, to start with. All of this milk is not equal in quality or fat content, so some of it is more suited to, say, making butter than it is for drinking. Next, we must ask how much of the milk that is produced should go to making ice cream, cheese, whole milk, skimmed milk, semi-skimmed milk, respectively. How much of the whole, semi-skim, and skim milk should be set aside for use in pastries, as opposed to cookies, as opposed to plain drinking milk? If all of these decisions have to be made by a central planning bureau, they would need vast amounts of information to base these decisions on, not the least of which includes the number of people who want each product, but also the preferences of each person for any of these products, in order to then rank and file the likelihood of the desire for these products at any given point. When you account also for the fact that human desires are not fixed and can be fickle and influenced by advertising, then you run into an even bigger headache of trying to predict these individual preferences across thousands, millions, or even billions of people, depending on the scope and scale of the government. Now, beyond just one product, consider that each and every product you can imagine has a similar story, and is tied in to just about every other such story for every other product in the economy. The production of a hairbrush uses petrochemicals and energy. Those could have been also used in producing cartons for the milk industry or ice cream manufacturers. What if this authority gets their predictions wrong, and they produce far more milk than people want to use? What if it goes bad, while people's hair remains messy for want of a hairbrush? Furthermore, since the central planners are always a part of the political structure, their incentives can change drastically. If a grand amount of milk goes bad, a central planner can use their authority in the government to write off the loss, or to attempt to cover up the mistake, and is often incentivized to do so. A man who owns a milk-producing business, on the other hand, will have a much harder time explaining to any investors why sales are down so drastically for the quarter. And thus, one of the alternatives to central planning, the free market, delegates all of these decisions to the person that has the greatest incentive to actually use resources as effectively and efficiently as they are able to, the person whose money and property is involved. Of course, free markets have their own problems. One of these is the concept of external costs. These are costs that are borne by people outside of the economic interaction. If a widget factory dumps toxic sludge into a river, the people living by that river pay various costs associated with this, while they are probably not a partner in the widget trade. Devising and implementing fair and reasonable standards to either minimize said costs, such as environmental regulation or emission standards, or to turn them back on the actual participants, extra taxes for sanitation of water, are clearly the purview of law and of government. It is, however, always a difficult balance to maintain, as the area of economic activity is so complex and is ever changing. A final misconception that we would like to address is the misconception of economic activity as a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game is a game with a fixed pot. This pot can be subdivided amongst the players, and the redistribution and trade can take place within the game, but the total pot of resources from which can be drawn stays fixed or the same. Of course, scarce resources are fixed in amount in a purely physical sense, and so, to some degree, we can understand where this idea comes from. But when applied to the whole of economic activity, this concept falls flat. It does not take into account that wealth is a product generated by the transaction of goods, and that the transaction is a fundamental property of human desires which cannot be quantified. Even the most flawed theories of value must concede that the total amount of wealth available increases over time due to various factors, such as the application of human labor and ingenuity. This fatal misconception ties into a final point to tie this all together. Value. Where does it come from? When I offer to sell you an item, what is the value of that item? Is it what it cost me, purchase, transportation, time, and labor? If it is, and that price is lower than what I'm asking you, then my profit is truly at your expense. Is it the price I'm asking for it? If so, then what is to stop me from asking for simply any arbitrary price? The answer to this question is once again far-reaching in its simplicity. The value of something is what someone is willing to pay for it. If you can produce a product and sell it at a profit, your activity is economically viable. People want what you have to sell at that price. If you find a way to lower the price, maybe more people will want what you have to sell. However, if you raise prices, for instance, because some other industry is buying up resources you need, people may easily substitute your product for another. Nectarines for oranges, Pepsi for Coke, margarine for butter. This is where the true basic reason for the failure of central planning and the necessity of economic freedom lies. Value cannot be calculated because all value is human value, individual value. You cannot measure it absolutely, and there are too many of us doing too many things to make it viable, even if you could. The best we can hope to do, as our current standard of living shows, is to let everyone be free to make their own decisions, economic and otherwise, within a fair framework or laws applying to all. In closing, we leave you with a quote by the late, great Milton Friedman. Underlying most arguments against the free market is often a lack of belief in freedom itself. Thank you for watching.